Good morning, dear ladies and gentlemen, colleagues and friends. Welcome at the 19th Annual Conference of the European Society of International Law. The topic of the conference is technological change and international law. And last week, at the peak of the preparation for this conference, my computer crashed down, went completely black. And as I was staring at the black screen, I thought how dependent and how vulnerable we are. How technology shapes perceptions of what is possible and what is not. Besides biases and blind spots of technology, there are discussions. How much regulation is desirable and possible to impose on new technology? What kind of new risks we are facing and managing? Many of those questions are also asked at the national and regional level. But technology, like climate, has no borders. Therefore, international law and multilateralism is the only way to solve those questions. I wish you inspiring presentations and productive discussions in the coming days. I only hope that your dedicated work and thoughtful reflections may help to make better informed and just decisions for the world and for the future generations of the humanity. Now, I would like to invite the Dean of the Law Faculty, the host of this conference, Haroldas Šinkūnas, to welcome you.
Dear colleagues, dear friends, ladies and gentlemen, I'm really very happy and honored to congratulate all of you who are engaged in international law. But there is another reason to congratulate you all. I also congratulate you on the 20th anniversary of the ESIL organization, which unites experts in international law. I'm very pleased that this event is not only taking place in Vilnius, the capital of Lithuania, but also that one of its organizers is the law faculty of Vilnius University. I often refer to our faculty as the royal one, as it was founded by the privilege of the King of Poland and Grand Duke of Lithuania, Vladislav IV Vasa. And our faculty will soon celebrate 383rd anniversary. I'm really proud that we are the organizers of such a significant event like this, and I believe that it will be both interesting and fruitful, allowing not only for the discussion of current issues in international law in the context of rapid technological change, but also to get to know Vilnius and Lithuania, which some of you may be visiting for the first time. I would also like to sincerely thank all the organizers of the conference, especially Dr. Inga Martinkutė, whose energy has inspired all of us and who has proven that with a lot of desire and focused work, we can achieve a great deal. Thank you, Inga. I also sincerely thank all the partners. Yeah, it was a good occasion. Thanks again. I also sincerely thank all the partners and sponsors of the conference for your contribution. When addressing you, esteemed experts in international law, one would typically discuss the significance of international law and its importance for relations between states, including for maintaining international peace and security. However, other thoughts are on my mind today. Although it's very sad, I would like to ask, do we still have international law? Looking at the modern world, I would like to ask, is international law in a parallel world? Or have we fallen into a parallel world and forgotten the rules of international law? Today's world seems to have been taken over by the ancient idea that justice is what benefits the stronger. It seems that this has also become a rule in international relations. When we see what's happening in Ukraine, Israel, or other parts of the world, we need to talk about the international law with a great anxiety and sadness. Or is war something that must make us reflect and discover opportunities for international law to grow and improve, as Hugo Grotius did almost 400 years ago when he formulated the principles of international law during the first 30 years war. It is clear we must do something to restore international law, a law that is real. The topic of this conference is technological change and international law. The conference organizers have created a really attractive program that covers many interesting and relevant issues. However, looking at the conference program, I believe that during it, you will also discuss the fundamental questions I mentioned regarding modern international law, so that international law becomes the foundations of an international order where the rights and freedoms of all people are respected. The relationships between states are based on mutual respect, and all disputes are resolved peacefully. Taking this opportunity, esteemed guests, I would like to thank all of the conference speakers and moderators. I'm sure that your presentations will be very interesting, inspiring, and will spark further discussions. I'm confident that they will be not only interesting, but also useful, so that you return home knowing what to do to make our world better and more beautiful. And of course, I wish you a good time, not only at this conference, but also in our city, Vilnius. Thank you very much.
Now it's my pleasure to give a floor to the Chancellor of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Inga Černiuk.
Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, it's above a great honor and a privilege to address such a distinguished gathering of experts, thought leaders, academic and technologists from all around the world. We are here today at a critical juncture in history, where the rapid evolution of technology intersects with the foundation principles of international law and innovation. This convergence is not merely a technical challenge, but a profound moment that calls for reflection, dialogue, and collective action. As we gather here in Vilnius, Lithuania, a nation at the crossroads of East and West, we are reminded of the profound importance of our geopolitical context. Lithuania's location at the very heart of the European Union and NATO is more than just a point on the map. It's a testament of resilience, courage, and the strategic foresight of its people. In these challenging times, as conflict rages on our borders, Lithuania's role as a bastion of democracy, security, and technological innovation is more vital than ever. The ongoing war between Russia and Ukraine has brought the realities of geopolitical instability to the forefront of international discourse. It is a stark reminder that the principles of sovereignty, territorial integrity, and the rule of law must be upheld with unwavering commitment. Lithuania, with a deep historical ties and understanding of the region, stands as a critical voice in advocating of these values on the global stage. As we confront these immediate challenges, we must also look into the future. Technology, in all its forms, is reshaping the world around us. From cybersecurity to artificial intelligence, the tools we create today will define the contours of our societies for years to come. But with this power comes great responsibility. As we harness the potential of these technologies, we must ensure that they are developed and deployed in ways that respect human rights, promote transparency, and foster international cooperation. This is where the intersection of law and technology becomes so crucial. The legal frameworks we establish today will either empower or constrain the innovation for tomorrow. They will determine whenever technology serves as a force of a good or becomes a tool of oppression. In this context, that Lithuania, with its commitment to democratic values and its strategic position in the world, can offer unique insight and leadership. Over the next few days, we will explore this theme in depth. We will discuss the challenges and opportunities that arise at the international law and technology. We will consider how international law cooperation can be strengthened to address the global challenges that we face. And we will reflect on the role that each of our nations must play in shaping a future that is both just and secure. As representatives of a global community, it is our responsibility to navigate these uncharted waters with foresight, wisdom, and commitment to upholding the values that bind us together. The discussions we will have during this conference are not just about technology, but about the future we are building for generations to come. In closing, let me reiterate the importance of our work here today. The challenges we face are significant, but so too are the opportunities. Together, we can forge a path forward that not only embraces the potential of technology, but also ensures that it's used in a ways that uphold the principles of justice, peace, and human dignity. I wish you all fruitful, challenging discussions. Thank you.
Just before giving the floor for the opening discussion, I would like to say a few words of gratitude to the partners and sponsors of this conference, without whom our gathering would be impossible today. So, first of all, the partners, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Ministry of Justice, Go Vilnius. And then we have a plethora of law firms that also the support of the idea of international law. That is TGS Baltic, Glimstead, and our longtime partner, Foley Hogue. Also, among the supporters of the conference are Max Planck Institute. Give them a round of applause. Thank you very much. Thank you for your support. And now I would like to give the floor to our opening discussion and its moderator, as well as the keynote speaker. Please welcome on stage.
Good morning. I'm too short for this. Good morning. My name is Jekaterina Govina. I will be chairing this first session. I'm lecturer in a couple of universities here in Lithuania. I'm teaching on fintech, financial technology. And it's actually this session is really close to my heart because I used to be a regulator for the major part of my professional life. So I worked at Central Bank at Lithuania, meaning that we regulated and supervised the financial sector. So when fintech emerged, so a lot of questions emerged as a consequence. First of all, should we regulate new phenomena? Yeah, like crowdfunding, peer-to-peer lending, crypto, different kind of digital assets, and so on. So it's always like, should we regulate it at first step? Or if yes, then to what extent? If no, so for how long should we tolerate this phenomena? Then we need to step in. Yeah, so, and the same is happening with artificial intelligence right now. So it's a question whether we should regulate it. Yes, how we should shape governance and supervision of artificial intelligence. And we will be actually discussing and listening for this today. So we will hear a keynote from Simon Chesterman from National University of Singapore. Is it right? Yeah, it's correct. And then he will be followed by Dr. Roxana Vatanparast from the University of Capital University Law School. So Dr. Roxana, she will provide her remarks and ask questions to Simon. So thank you very much for your attention, and I will invite Simon to give his keynote. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And it's a great pleasure to be here. My first visit to Vilnius. Great to see Inga. Thank you so much for inviting me. Although I confess I feel like a bit of a fraud as an Australian whose first academic job was in America. I'm now based in Asia for 17 years. I can only assume I'm here through some sort of diversity program. You want other continents represented. But it's also a great honor to be here around the occasion of the ESIL's 20th anniversary, which, as I learned last night, was a more arduous enterprise than the creation of the European Union itself. Multiple honors in my case. So I've been asked to talk about AI governance. As we just heard, this is a live issue around the world. Europe, of course, playing a key role in this. And what I'd like to do today is talk a bit about some of the issues surrounding this, in particular what I describe as the tragedy of AI governance, which is the mismatch between incentives, explaining perhaps some of the challenges we're facing now in terms of addressing this problem. But in some ways, it should be a golden age. Those of us who study AI governance are not wanting for material. There are literally now hundreds and hundreds of documents outlining principles, guidelines, frameworks, purporting to govern this new and important technology. This really took off around the 2010s with the rise of machine learning, and in particular around 2016 to 2018. And the reason for that sort of uplift was a realization that the consequences of misused AI went far beyond a sort of bizarre recommendation on Amazon or even not getting a loan approved. But as the Cambridge Analytica scandal demonstrated, AI and the manipulation of people through algorithms had the prospect not only of affecting individuals, but of affecting world history, potentially affecting the outcome of an election in the most powerful country on the planet. And so there is an enormous amount of material to study here, but there seems to be a mismatch between words and deeds. Because despite all of these concerns being expressed about the importance of governing this technology, one of the things that we're all aware of is the massive increase and an ongoing increase in the deployment of ever more powerful models. And this has, among other things, economic but also climate implications. But in the sphere of AI governance, it's also a real challenge in terms of how you might rein these things in, how you might control them. We've also seen a corresponding diminution in the efforts on the part of companies themselves to control these models. There are pretty clear suggestions that all of the incentives in place are not holding companies back, but rather driving them forward. We've seen examples like in the context of facial recognition, where Google and Meta had facial recognition technologies that they did not deploy for fear of ethical and potentially legal consequences. And then when a startup released similar technology, they felt obliged to release it themselves. So as a result, we have a challenge. And what I'm going to do today is talk a little bit about the kind of problem that we might be facing, and then three of the structural challenges that are limiting our ability to respond to it. The first being the turn to industry, the second, the reluctance of states to act, and thirdly, the dysfunction of global governance approaches. So in terms of the problem, I'm not a catastrophist. I'm actually overall optimistic about AI. I was talking earlier over coffee with someone that I'm more worried about the climate crisis than I am about AI. But there is a non-zero chance that AI turns nasty. And this is a common image among developers. This is the idea of the Shoggoth, which goes back to H.G. Lovecraft, that behind the smiley face of AI is a sort of menacing being. And one of the striking things about the studies of the people working in this technology is the number who will say that there is a real chance of AI destroying humanity, some of them saying up to 10% chance, and then they go back to working on this technology. And there's a fascinating anthropological study to be done there about the mismatch between what people do and what they say. I mean, if you thought there was a serious 10% chance of something you were working on destroying humanity, you would probably rethink your life choices. So I think a lot of this is exaggerated. I don't rule it out to zero, but I'm much less worried about AI than I am about humans. And this is quite old now. This is, some of you might have heard, after ChatGPT was released in November 2022, it was only about 6 months later that Chaos GPT was released, which was connected to the internet and given a very simple instruction, destroy humanity. Now, it was unsuccessful. And I find this an interesting case, partly because of the developer who sort of released it into the wild, I think as a hoax, but primarily because of what happened when it had a live Twitter feed and was expressing in real time its thinking process, saying that it was given the task of destroying humanity. It had worked out that nuclear weapons would be a viable means of destroying humanity, but it was unable to obtain these weapons. Again, that's all quite rational. The machine was just doing what it was told. What I found fascinating was the number of humans who were interacting with it on Twitter, encouraging it, don't give up on your dreams, you'll find a way, keep trying. So again, all of this to say that I'm less worried about the machines, not to reduce that to zero, than I am about what people will do with machines. An analogous but slightly different concern is the way in which we will use these machines. And one thing I'm working on at the National University of Singapore is trying to think through how this technology might change the nature of education, what role universities might play 10 years from now. And one of the things that this technology is doing is reducing the cost of creativity towards zero. And that can be amazing. It can offer us the ability to generate incredible images, like this series of images created using Midjourney, a series of selfies in different historical and ethnic periods. And if you look at these images, you might find them, as I do, kind of beautiful. But as you look at them, you realize there's also something a bit uncanny about them. And it's not merely that in First Nations or Maasai warrior culture or Japanese samurai culture, people didn't have cameras to take selfies like this, nor indeed would people smile like this. And so the more closely you look at them, you might realize that what's really happening is you have a kind of cliched image of a First Nations person, a Maasai warrior, a Japanese samurai, overlaid over a very American image of a selfie. And this, sorry, I realize that Kevin Spacey's not really persona non grata, so Inge, if it's okay, I'll just stand you in for him. And so this I find is a useful reminder that what this technology is doing is the appearance of creativity, but actually what it's doing is reducing creativity to a lowest common denominator. And Ted Chiang actually had a great piece, I think, in the New Yorker last week, talking about the difference between AI creativity and human creativity. And all of us in the room are involved in creative enterprises. And part of creativity is effort. And that's one thing that AI is taking away, the need for effort. And again, as we think about the role of universities, the reason we set our students essays to write at university is not because the world needs more essays that they could do very quickly using generative AI, but rather that the process of writing an essay helps us think through things, helps us understand the world in a new way. And there's a real risk that AI could give the illusion of doing that work for us, but actually taking away what's valuable in that enterprise. Okay, another image. This is a real image. Some of you might have seen it before, from 1956, Dartmouth College. This is the retreat at which the term artificial intelligence is generally regarded to have been coined. And I find this image useful as a reminder, to me at least, for a couple of reasons. The first is the irrational exuberance. These guys got funding from the Rockefeller Foundation on the basis that they said with 2 months of funding, they thought they could pretty much solve AI. and obviously they didn't. And this mismatch between expectations and reality in AI has been a recurrent challenge, giving rise to the term of an AI winter. And indeed, some are now speculating that perhaps we're hitting another AI winter as the promise of generative AI might have peaked. I tend not to buy into that camp. I think this is really going to transform our relationship to knowledge. It's going to impact the economy across all sectors. But that's one reminder. The second reason for this photo is complete lack of diversity. A bunch of white guys sitting around planning the world. That's less of an issue now in terms of the number of people doing research in AI. There's a lot more women, a lot more people of color, in particular in Asia. China is a huge player in the space. But the underlying data remains often biased. And that's something that I'll come back to at the end, talking about United Nations processes here, because it's easy in a place like Lithuania or Singapore to think about AI and bias meaning sort of just misrepresentation. But there are whole parts of the world that are excluded from this conversation, which I'll come back to at the end. Okay, so what is the problem? So I won't go through this in great detail, but this is one way of thinking about the regulatory challenges posed by AI, which I've grouped into speed, autonomy, and opacity. Speed is just the fact that computers can do things quickly. Nothing very new there. And one of the reasons this gives rise to challenges is that we discover some practical consequences when things happen at speed. And the illustration there is from almost 14 years ago, the flash crash, when $1 trillion was wiped off the New York Stock Exchange in 30 minutes. Much of it came back in 15 minutes. No one really knew what was happening. And the reason for this was high-frequency trading algorithms, which in theory are governed by the same laws that would govern you and me if we were engaging in trades, but we might be able to engage in several trades a minute if we're very quick. These algorithms were engaging in tens of thousands of trades every second. And so that's not actually a legal problem, it's a practical challenge that has given rise to circuit breakers, efforts to slow down things. So hopefully that challenge is reasonably clear, as are some of the solutions. Autonomy is a little bit more complicated. Autonomy is the capacity of these entities, these machines, to take decisions without additional human intervention, giving rise to the question, well, who's responsible when things go wrong? And in the case of autonomous vehicles, for example, some people worry if the driver has no control, who would you blame? Also not a particularly difficult challenge to address. We would already have a problem if I crash into Inga because I'm driving badly. She could sue me. But if I injure Inga because my car blows up next to her, no point suing me. I'm dead. I didn't do anything. But you could go after the manufacturer. And we've seen moves towards product liability through the 20th century and analogous debates, which the European Union was very helpful in, pointing out that product liability principles could indeed apply to AI. Opacity, the quality of being difficult or impossible to understand, is a slightly more difficult problem because it goes to the heart of understanding attribution of responsibility and attribution of blame. If it is not just complex, but impossible for humans to understand how an algorithm's processes work, how an outcome was reached, then that does pose a real problem if we want to allocate responsibility, if we want to allocate risk. And indeed, it's kind of shocking that many of these models are now being released when the developers will say that they do not know how some of these machines work, how some of these consequences are reached. It's important to understand you don't need to understand everything. I was talking with a colleague in Singapore at a medical technology event, and he pointed out that doctors have been prescribing aspirin for more than a century. They don't know how it works, they don't know why it works, but it works, and they're going to keep on prescribing it. And indeed, there are some areas of life where we don't need to understand reasons, but if there's one area where we do, it's law. And so all this to say that these are some of the challenges. There would be ways of addressing this, but I don't want to go into that today. What I want to look at rather is the structural barriers that are making it harder to address these challenges. And that starts with the turn to industry. Now, many of you will have seen, actually, can I get a sense, who has used ChatGPT or Gemini or some other chatbot? Okay, maybe the other way. Has anyone never used ChatGPT or Gemini? Okay, a couple of people, good for you. You are immune to the mind virus, perhaps. So if you followed OpenAI, you might have followed last November, the saga, when Sam Altman was sacked for 5 days, then came back. The board that sacked him was itself sacked. And this is, in a microcosm, a case study of why we should not rely on self-regulation. OpenAI was set up in around 2015 with the aspirational goal of developing AI for humanity with many safeguards in place. But as it grew, it became less open, more closed, and more secretive and more profit-focused. The reason being, they very quickly discovered that if they were going to develop the kind of models that they needed much more capital. And so the not-for-profit was replaced by a capped for-profit regime. And those of you who are interested in the intellectual property side of this, that was around the time that they started hiring lawyers and stopped telling people how their models are being trained. Nonetheless, there was this complex structure with a not-for-profit board, not-for-profit company trying to control the for-profit company with the aim of doing all this for humanity. But when there was a clash, in particular when Sam Altman, heading the for-profit company, clashed with the board representing the not-for-profit company, the short answer is that the money won. And this has been a consistent outcome in these debates within organizations, where there has been an effort to hold things back and there's been a profit motive that drives in the opposite direction, money wins. This is not just a problem in theory in terms of corporate structure. It's a problem because this is where all the action is happening. Now, what we use now as large language models, ChatGPT, Gemini, and the like, they started in universities. But all of that research, all of that development has now, almost all of it, has moved to companies. The most powerful models are almost all run by companies, and most of the research is happening there now. 10 years ago, PhDs in graduating in AI, this is from the United States, were about equal, the number going to industry or academia, and now it's about 2/3 go to industry and less than 1/3 go to academia. Very few go to government. We're also seeing AI companies play a greater role at academic conferences, in particular AI developer conferences, with a growing number of papers produced by AI companies. Now, this is not inherently a bad thing. In many areas of life, we see public-private partnerships. The pharmaceutical industry depends on partnership between private sector and public sector. But in the context of AI, it's leading to a couple of consequences. One is speed. And in some ways, this is cool. Many of you will know that ChatGPT crossed all sorts of records by reaching 100 million people in less than 2 months. The problem is, those of you who do research at universities will know, if you were developing something that was going to be released into a population where it could adversely affect humans, you would have to go through institutional review board, ethics, procedures, and so on. None of that applies to these companies. And so what's happening is we are not just beta testers for these new technologies. We are laboratory rats in a grand experiment as we sort of find out what's happening when this technology is released to the world, what the use cases will be. And again, the companies are clear about this. They say they do not know what the use cases will be. They want to let people test it and without guardrails. And I think that's at least a cause for concern. Another issue is what this does in terms of the way in which the research is being directed. What is the aim of these objectives? What is the aim of the research? What are the developers and deployers trying to do? And without being too starry-eyed about academia, academics are not always focused on the bottom line. But as the research, as the data, the talent, compute has moved towards industry, there are greater pressures on those developers and deployers to generate profits. And what that means is that there is a push to realize the economic benefits of AI, with many consultancies, McKinsey, Bain, and others, trying to direct that in ways that will affect the bottom line of companies. One way of thinking this, I think it was Stephen Russell who put it this way when I first heard it, is the technology being used to address met needs or unmet needs? By unmet needs, I mean things that no human could do. And in areas like drug discovery, protein folding, there are things that would take humans centuries or would be impossible for humans to discover new drugs. And that is an amazing application of this technology with transformative implications. But a lot of the activity is being used to address met needs just more quickly and more cheaply. And so a lot of the technology is clearly being used to monetize human attention and to replace human labor. One of the concerns in my part of the world, Southeast Asia, in the Philippines, is that this will be used primarily to replace call centers with a lot of negative consequences for people in the Philippines. So how is this being directed? Why is it being directed? Where is the money taking it? I think is a legitimate cause for concern. Okay, so in this environment where you have companies incentivized to make money with few guardrails, this is where you would expect the state to step in. Unfortunately, states are wary. Now, when states think about regulating, why do they regulate or why do they not regulate? And basically, the states regulate for one of two reasons. They regulate to address market failures or in support of social or other values. An example of market failures, going back to my crashing into Inga example earlier, is that if you attribute responsibility to a driver in an autonomous vehicle where the driver has ever less control, that's an inefficient outcome because the driver might have minimal responsibility, the driver's got minimal capacity to change. We saw that through the 20th century. At the start of the 20th century, buyer beware, product liability had not been invented yet. You had, in theory, a market where if things went wrong, you could sue the manufacturer and then the courts would work it out. As manufacturing processes became more complicated through the 20th century, product liability emerged as a solution because relying on individuals suing manufacturers was inefficient, and the people with the greatest capacity to address the risks, to manage them, were the manufacturers. We could see something similar in the AI space, but the debate going on in California right now about SB 1047 shows the wariness, this is the legislation that might or might not get signed into law, the wariness of these organizations taking on any kind of responsibility. Indeed, it was in 2011 that an American researcher actually argued that AI developing companies should be given immunity from prosecution or from liability for fear of them being exposed to risk that would hold back innovation. So we can address market failures if we choose to. The other reason we regulate is in support of social or other policies. The reason we prohibit discrimination is nothing to do with the market, or at least not usually. It's because we feel that it's unjust whether a human discriminates or a company discriminates or an AI system discriminates. Against this, however, is a real wariness of regulating on the part of smaller states in particular, and I can put Singapore very much in that category. There is a real wariness of losing a competitive advantage or driving it elsewhere. When the European Union adopts the GDPR, the Digital Markets Act, Digital Services Act, there are teams of lawyers who will debate how to comply with these things. In Meta's case, they delayed rolling out Threads, but the European Union is a big enough market that they're not going to abandon it completely. Singapore, if we did this, many companies would simply ship out of town. We've seen examples of this in 2001 when the United States imposed a moratorium on stem cell research, largely for Christian ideological reasons. That just led countries like Singapore to invest massively in the bioeconomy, and it saw a transfer of research from the United States to Singapore. So these are not purely theoretical concerns. There is a real wariness of driving innovation away. We do now have a couple of models, though, of regulation, and one is the United States. The United States, more kind of glass half full, is presented as a kind of market-based approach, the European Union as a rights-based approach, China you can think of as state-centric. The United States market approach is partly ideological and embrace of the free market, partly it's also dysfunction. It's very hard to get anything passed in the United States. Indeed, it's striking that the only major piece of technology legislation that's been passed since 1996 in the United States, when the Communications Decency Act established that internet platforms were not responsible for the content transmitted across them. Apart from things like child online privacy protection and other kind of niche areas, the only legislation at the federal level adopted in the United States has been the effort to ban TikTok, because the United States can agree on one thing, that they're wary of China, even though it's headed by a Singaporean. That's a whole other story. So the United States is one model. The European Union clearly putting out a marker saying that the rights-based approach, even if it has negative economic consequences, is a worthwhile enterprise. And I know there are many people in the room who know much more about this than I, and I look forward to learning more about that maybe in conversation. China is an understudied and I think a very interesting example where until a couple of years ago, I would have said China really approached this purely through a state sovereignty, national security lens. And that's largely still true, but China has actually adopted extremely interesting legislation requiring certain forms of algorithmic transparency, requiring that its large language models be truthful and in alignment with socialist values, whatever that means. And indeed, there's a game you can play where you take recent Chinese legislation, translate it into English, and ask people if that's European or Chinese. And often it's hard to tell the difference. So there are studies, and Anu Bradford is a good example of this. Her book, Digital Empires, contrasts this sort of horizontal choice between the US approach, free market, European market-based, Chinese state sovereignty, and she argues essentially that in the hope of bolstering the Brussels effect, the United States should gang up with Europe against China. I'm simplifying slightly. But in many ways, I think that sort of horizontal debate is much less important and much less challenging than the vertical one within all these jurisdictions, within all of our jurisdictions, between the state and the private sector, for the reasons I highlighted earlier. As countries think about whether to regulate, a slightly different question is when to regulate. And some of you may be familiar with the Collingridge dilemma. This goes back to a book in 1980, David Collingridge, in The Social Control of Technology, not really writing about AI or computers at all, basically suggested that at an early stage of innovation, it's easy to regulate, but you don't know what the harms are. The longer you wait, the clearer those harms become, but the cost of regulation goes way up. And a good illustration of this is social media. So my oldest child was born in 2004, the same year that Facebook was launched. Back in 2004, we could have controlled Facebook. We could have controlled social media, the way they use data, the algorithms, and so on, but we didn't know about teenage anxiety and depression. We didn't know about Cambridge Analytica, electoral manipulation, and so we did nothing, or very, very little. 2024 comes around, and now, in retrospect, we know what the problems are, but it's much, much harder to regulate, much, much harder to put that toothpaste back in the tube or the genie back in the bottle. And I think this realization that we were asleep at the wheel with the rise of social media is one reason why around the world governments really are trying to grapple with governance of AI, but for all the reasons I've highlighted earlier, they're not entirely sure what to do. In such a situation where you have companies out of control, states unwilling or unable to coordinate, that would seem to be a ripe area for international coordination. And sorry, this is my sort of self-regulation state, and this is my favorite Magritte painting about international diplomacy. But it's very hard at the international level. There have been efforts in the past that we can draw on. And so there are some good examples. There are examples of efforts to control technology, but when this works, it tends to either be when it's very uncontroversial or when there's a crisis. So what would one's priorities be at the international level if you wanted to think about structures? Well, drawing on some past examples, you could think about entities with universal membership. In addition to the UN itself, we've got the International Telecommunications Union and UNESCO, which have adopted interesting principles on AI for good. UNESCO had the ethical guidelines. I think UNESCO actually had one of the few really good frameworks adopted on the use of generative AI in education, where the only thing they could really agree on was to keep generative AI out of the hands of children. But against universal membership, one of the arguments that's put forward is actually some entities really prefer non-universal membership. So the OECD, the Global Partnership on AI, the only reason the United States joined the Global Partnership on AI was when there is essentially an agreement to exclude China. And so universal membership could be one axis that one thinks about. What about alignment of regulations and procedures? The International Civil Aviation Organization is a good example of a pretty technocratic organization, rarely in the news, helps keep the airplanes flying, establishes flight patterns and so on, but not necessarily applicable to the complex use cases of AI. What about multi-stakeholder coordination? This is one of the key challenges, going back to the increasing role of companies, is how you could involve them in international processes. Because if there's one thing that many, many member states of the UN like and agree on at the UN, it's that it's a club of states. And so involving corporations is a real challenge in the context of the UN. But you could have internet cooperation of assigned names and numbers. That's a good multi-stakeholder enterprise, but it's a pretty narrow mandate in terms of resolving naming disputes. What about experts who share data and advanced knowledge? The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is a good example that I'll come back to in a couple of moments, where there has been an effort to share information about risks and, in the context of AI, potentially opportunities. But clearly the climate crisis has not been solved by the IPCC, but at least we've got sort of common benchmarks, although it took a long time to get there. And one of the issues in the context of AI is whether we'll have time to do that. Then we have my favorite, which is the idea of a grand bargain with some red lines and sharing information on disasters. This is modeled on the International Atomic Energy Agency. A couple of years back, I wrote, and a number of other people have written about the idea that if you go back through the history of nuclear energy and nuclear weaponry, even from the time when nuclear weapons were being researched, the scientists knew that there was potential, obviously, for catastrophic harm. That was kind of the point, but also for transformative economic impacts in terms of the ability to generate energy, the impact on medicine and agriculture. The energy claims have never been fully realized, but clearly potential. And the IAEA, at its heart, has a grand bargain that in exchange for a commitment not to weaponize, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, you had, beginning in the 1960s, some of the biggest international scientific conferences ever with the sharing of technology. I even came up with a cute little logo for the IAIA, the International Artificial Intelligence Agency, but alas, I don't think anyone should be holding their breath to see that realized. There has been an effort at the UN, however, and I've played a tiny role in this, the AI advisory body. I'm working with the Secretariat to help that process along, concluded its report. It's only being released in a couple of weeks at the Summit of the Future in New York, but this being the UN, you can download it off the internet. It's already been leaked. I think Politico has it, among others. And this was a fascinating process where there was a true multi-stakeholder initiative, representatives from around the world, from private sector, public sector, civil society, coming together to try and work out how AI could be governed for humanity. And in terms of the challenge as the advisory body understood it was how to address what appeared to be a global governance deficit. Going back to my earlier example, you have these companies developing technology that's going to transform the world, but decisions are being made not only in a couple of countries, but in a few boardrooms by a handful of people. And it seems crazy that these decisions, which will clearly have impacts that affect all of us, are being made by so few people with such little oversight. And so just one example, even of the paucity of international governance, is that if you look at some of the major AI governance efforts, only 7 states are party to all of them. I apologize, this is written very small. 118 states are party to none of them, have no involvement at all in these processes outside of kind of proxies and lobbying. So some people would see this as a benefit. Those 7 countries are kind of happy that they're at the table, and that's basically the G7. But if you think that there needs to be some kind of legitimacy, some kind of global conversation about this, then greater participation would be important. And that's not just equity for the sake of equity, but because different perspectives are important here. And this is the difference between misuse and misuses, which is a line the Secretary General had outlined. And so in countries, again, like Lithuania, like in Singapore, we do worry about misuse of AI. But in many parts of the world, they worry more about misuses of AI. They worry more about being left behind, not being part of the transformative technologies that will increase efficiencies, that will optimize workflows, and so on. And it's kind of important to keep in mind that there are still about 2 billion people without access to the internet and something in the order of 750 million people without stable electricity. And so to the extent that we think that the benefits of AI should be shared equitably around the world, then the UN perhaps has a role to play. The third reason why the global governance deficit, I think, is a problem is effectiveness. That if you want these regimes to work, you're going to have global coverage. Because for all my analogy with the IAEA, nuclear technology is reasonably difficult to produce and reasonably easy to trace. None of this will apply to AI. And so if you have great governance, even in the European Union, that will not stop bad actors being able to develop and deploy it in other countries. And the European Union's legislative regime will not be a barrier to the consequences of that affecting European citizens. So we need some kind of global coordination if this regime is to be effective. So what's been recommended, and this is going before much of this will be in the Global Digital Compact, and it'll go before the Summit of the Future, as I said, in a couple of weeks. There were kind of 7.5 recommendations. The first is an international scientific panel, a bit like the IPCC, share information about opportunities and challenges. That seems pretty uncontroversial. We also need common ground. There needs to be some kind of policy dialogue about what's happening in terms of different approaches to AI governance, debates whether that should happen within the UN or elsewhere. And we also need clearer standards. There are now hundreds of standards that have been developed by the IEEE, by the ISO, by the International Telecommunications Union and others, but with very little coordination. And one of the reasons I got into this whole question of AI governance was talking with computer science AI developers who explained that basically they thought their job was to solve little problems that came before them, not to understand and predict the societal implications of their actions. And so there's a mismatch between a lot of these standards, which are very technical, but often addressing questions like fairness, accountability, transparency, that have very political rather than just technical consequences. The other aspect of this, going back to the misuses, was an effort in the context of the UN to ensure that there would be common benefits, that the opportunities created by AI would be distributed a little bit more equitably. And that requires addressing the challenges of talent, compute, and data. And this is epitomized by the challenge that states are finding as both talent, compute, and data, all three of them, have gone to industry. And so in terms of talent, there's long been efforts in the UN to develop human capacity. That seems reasonably uncontroversial. In terms of compute, there would be no point saying that developing countries should get access to the highest performing computer chips that even the wealthiest companies at the moment struggle to get. And so there was an effort rather to think through, well, how could you share resources, pool resources? There are very interesting discussions in Africa about continent-level pooled computing resources. And then in terms of data, again, back to that sort of misuses, there are many parts of the world that are just excluded from data. There is not good data on them. And even in Southeast Asia, that's a problem in countries like Indonesia, where the fact that people don't have access to traditional banking means that they have very challenging efforts getting access to credit. But if you can collect data on their economic activities, a bit like Hernando de Soto's work on informal capital, if you can formalize informal data, there are ways in which people can benefit from that. The coherent effort, the 7.5 examples I mentioned, the institutional arrangement that would support this, there were two possibilities debated. The most likely is an AI office, some sort of office within the UN that would coordinate activities, organize these events, and so on. There was a discussion about an AI agency, and indeed the original terms of reference from the Secretary General called on an AI agency to be created, but there was really no appetite to pursue that for reasons maybe we could talk about when people are, in the discussion. I mentioned the Global Digital Compact. That has also been leaked, and you can see already that it seems likely that some kind of international scientific panel will be supported, some kind of policy dialogue will be supported. The rest is all up in the air. Mainly because of the questions, the concerns about cost, and even the idea of an AI office. The language, I think, in revision 4 of the Global Digital Compact is it should be studied basically to make sure it's not too expensive. So where does that leave us? This is a fast-moving area. I won't go through all of these sort of news stories, except to say that there's a lot of ongoing activity. There's a lot of debate around the world, but not a lot of action. Indeed, the European Union, I think, deserves our thanks for putting out a marker, although many other countries are watching the European Union very carefully, seeing what economic consequences it has, and whether that sort of omnibus approach to regulating AI is the right approach. I can tell you in Singapore, I think it's very likely that we'll have much more of a kind of sectoral approach, addressing specific harms rather than trying to regulate AI as such. There are other approaches, including the possibility of regulating at the level of hardware, although at the moment that seems limited to US efforts to limit China's ability to have access to the highest performing computer. I mentioned earlier California, so there is this legislation addressing Silicon Valley in the environment where Silicon Valley has said they want regulation. Sam Altman went to Congress, says he wanted regulation. And what's fascinating is to watch the AI executives go before various forums and say, yes, we want regulation, but not this one, not that one, not the other one. When companies ask for regulation, when big companies ask for regulation, they're usually doing it for a few reasons. Sometimes I think some of them realize that some kind of regulation would in fact be helpful. Sometimes they know it's coming and they want to be part of that, and the intense lobbying to water down SB 1047 in California is an example of that. And then thirdly, they know that if there is regulation, it will raise the cost of entry for competitors. It will make it harder for them to enter the market and will therefore protect the vested interest of those in place. So all of these moving pieces, we'll watch with interest what happens into California. We'll watch with interest what happens in the Global Digital Compact and the Summit of the Future. All of us around the world are watching with interest what happens in the European Union with the AI Act, the Digital Services Act, Digital Markets Act. And I'll conclude with the summary of the tragedy of AI governance, which is the mismatch between incentives and leverage. That those with the greatest leverage, the companies, have the least incentive to regulate, while those with the greatest interest, like the UN, like those of us in this room, have virtually no leverage. Because companies have all of the incentives to develop and deploy ever more powerful models. States are wary, and if in doubt, are erring on the side of under-regulation rather than over-regulation. International organizations depend on both companies and states if they're going to be if they're going to play a meaningful role in regulation in this space. And as I touched on earlier, there's a real wariness about the manner in which you can involve in the UN. If you did want action at the global level, it's possible, but it's easiest either in a crisis or when it's very uncontroversial. Most people don't even think about the International Telecommunications Union. It's so old that its original name was the International Telegraph Union. And so there are many uncontroversial areas where international regulation is essential to the movement of people, of mail, and so on around the world. But if you want to address a real crisis, then if you want to have meaningful, powerful regulation, it's usually easiest in a crisis. The only reason we have the League of Nations is because of World War I. And the League of Nations, one of the reasons that was relatively weak is it was one of many treaties negotiated in Versailles in 1919. When the UN was being negotiated, what became the UN in San Francisco in 1945, they negotiated that while the bombs of the Second World War were still falling. And that's the only reason we have powerful entities like the Security Council for all of its flaws, because there was that sort of focused attention because of the crisis. The only reason we have the IAEA is Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And in the context of AI, at the moment, there is no appetite for major regulation, major control at the global level, partly because there is no evidence of an existential threat. But one of the concerns that many of us have is that if we ever do get to the point where there's a true AI crisis, we might need to create such an agency very quickly, if it's indeed possible at all, to try and address the second AI crisis. So I'll conclude with a 25-year-old Matrix reference. If you want to read more, many of you might have seen this, you have Mobius. If you want to stay in the realm of reality, I have a kind of serious book-length treatment of regulation of AI. But if you'd like to take the red pill and go down the rabbit hole, my reward to myself for doing the serious book was I wrote a speculative fiction novel about what AI might look like in the future in the form of artifice. Thank you very much for your attention. I'm looking forward to Roxana and your comments and questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Simon. It's really much food of thought, I think, for the audience. And I really invite you to think about questions, because after Roxana remarks questions, we will have opportunity for you to ask questions to both Simon and Roxana. So again, thank you very much, Simon. And now I pass the microphone to Roxana, and she will share her perspective and then ask some questions. Thank you.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much, Simon. That was a great presentation. Thank you for having me here. Thank you to the organizers for inviting me, and really grateful for the opportunity to engage with your insightful work. So your analysis really aptly captures the contradictions and challenges that are at the heart of governing AI meaningfully, and you highlight the necessity of global cooperation, given that AI systems are transboundary technologies, and you propose new institutional arrangements. I'd like to sort of connect with your remarks by asking, in terms of the turn to industry, why is it so? And sort of delve a little more deeply into that aspect, and then conclude with some questions for you. So my question is, why is there so much private power today in AI systems and governance? And what is the role of law and infrastructure in shaping that dynamic? So I hope to contribute a perspective that focuses on some of the underlying structural issues that shape the current and potentially future landscape of AI, and to tie them into your remarks and the challenges of AI governance. So first, the AI economy is deeply embedded in global value chains that span continents, linking resource extraction and labor in the global south with technological development in primarily the global north and China and the corporations that are based there. And these value chains really span a broad network of actors and data. And this labor and extraction includes everything from mining for raw materials to labeling toxic data sets. So these materials that are essential for the manufacture of chips, for example, that power AI systems, are extracted often under exploitative labor conditions with minimal benefits accruing to local populations. And meanwhile, the profits that are generated from the AI technologies are often concentrated in the big tech corporations, far removed from the communities that provide the foundational resources and labor. So the global AI economy is built on a foundation of asymmetrical power relations, exploitation of natural resources, and the labor of marginalized communities. And these inequalities are often shaped also by the law and perpetuated through a web of international trade agreements, intellectual property rights and laws, contractual arrangements, and corporate practices. And given the multiple actors and networks involved in these supply chains, this also creates challenges for attributing accountability. So I'm wondering if, based on that, how might we rethink some of the incentive structures that underlie the challenges to meaningful AI governance that you identify, such as those that shape the concentration of power in big tech, and that create such unequal distributions of the benefits and harms of the AI economy?
Okay, so great questions. And let me think of it in two ways. One is assuming the existing sort of frameworks, how you would change the incentives, and then how you might change the framework. And I think you're right. One of the issues is that there are lots of costs built into AI that are invisible to consumers. And that's intentional on the part of companies. So every time you put in a query to ChatGPT or Gemini, it costs OpenAI or Google in the order of a cent, which seems a small amount of money, but when it builds up over time, the number of people asking ridiculous queries becomes huge. And that cent is not just sort of a cost. There's a climate consequence to it in terms of the energy production. There's a sort of back-end cost in terms of the content moderation, and you're absolutely right. We still rely a lot on human content moderation, which is often disproportionately women in developing world working these centers. And so one question would be, well, could you reflect those costs more effectively? Could you push those costs onto consumers, or could you at least make it more transparent? When the aim of these organizations at the moment is to make this technology as attractive and easy to use as possible so that we all get hooked on it, so that we all get used to using it, and then it becomes part of our lives. So that would be the first thing, to try and make it more transparent. And I think one lever that might start to hold a bit of sway is the climate one. That as we become more aware of the fact that Google and Microsoft use more power than about 100 countries in the world, that the consequence of, Google, as someone was reminding me earlier, Google's basically said, well, we're not going to meet our net zero obligations because of the voracious appetite for AI. And at the moment, many of these organizations will say, oh, but don't worry, AI will solve the climate crisis at some unspecified point in the future. So that would be the first thing, is to think about the transparency, assuming existing frameworks. The second approach is to change the game. So as you highlighted, one of the issues is these companies are powerful and not always accountable. So there would be two ways in which you could address that. One is to bring them into the conversation much more formally. So Elon Musk, Starlink, whatever it's called, operates almost like a company these days. We heard reference to the ongoing crisis in Ukraine, and Elon Musk is responsible for communications in a war zone and gets approached by countries, by militaries, needing his permission to maintain lines of communication. And it's crazy that this is a private enterprise, one individual. And so if he wants to act like a state, maybe he should be held accountable like a state. And you can imagine, I mean, this would be purely hypothetical, some of these companies being treated more like countries with a transformation in the way in which we think about international law, being all sorts of challenges there. But that would be one way of approaching it. I can see all sorts of difficulties there. So the alternative is make them less powerful, break them up. And we've seen in the European Union, we've seen in America, efforts to use antitrust or monopoly legislation to try and break up these companies. If they're too big to control, then they're just too big. So you should break them up. We'll see what happens. It's now, I actually know someone at Microsoft who joined Microsoft 25 years ago to fight the monopoly ruling against them now. And he was sort of sympathizing with his Google colleagues, but saying, don't worry, it'll take years for any of this to happen. The European Union, I think, has a really interesting approach, identifying these sort of gatekeeper companies for special regulation. We'll see how that works out. But as I mentioned earlier, China is an interesting case, not to hold it up as a model for the world, but China has actually broken up companies. So in the period 2020 to 2023, Alibaba, which China determined had got too big, was broken into 6 entities. So that would be the alternative approach, is to break these companies up. If they're too big to regulate, then they're just too big and they should be broken up.
Thank you. Okay, so second, the AI economy depends not only on raw materials and labor, but also on access to data and computational power, or compute, as you also noted, which is a resource that's also increasingly concentrated in the hands of a few global players. That includes companies like Amazon, Microsoft, and Google that dominate the cloud computing market, for example. They control the vast data centers that house the computational power needed to train and deploy data-hungry AI models. And these data centers are often located in regions with access to cheap electricity and favorable regulatory environments. And they constitute a new form of resource control, we could say. So you also mentioned this in your talk, but compute governance is increasingly playing a role in global control and contestation over AI development. And this was seen with the US export controls restricting US companies' exports of advanced semiconductors to China and restrictions on US outbound investments in China's semiconductor and AI sectors. And these moves really illustrate how compute is entangled with national security concerns and assertions of state sovereignty in many ways. So while private companies play a very dominant role in AI systems, states also shape their development through the implementation of regulations, developing strategic initiatives and partnerships on AI governance with other states, and prioritizing national security concerns around digital infrastructure. So this concentration of computational power is often facilitated, again, by law and policy that may favor large corporations, as well as the infrastructural role that compute plays in the AI economy, which further entrenches private power by creating dependencies and lock-in effects. So I'm wondering, given sort of the geopolitical stakes with regard to digital infrastructure and compute currently, what are your thoughts in terms of governance of infrastructure, in terms of potentials for meaningful AI governance?
Yeah, so I mean, this is another huge challenge. So NVIDIA, as many of you will know, started off as a gaming company, and these graphical processing units became the sort of lifeblood of AI, and it's now, depending on what happens with the stock market, either the most valuable or second most valuable company on the planet. And the challenge there is this is just really hard to do. And NVIDIA is very good at what it does. And so it's got this kind of monopoly, and whether it exercises those monopoly powers is something that'll be subject to litigation. But what, if anything, should you do about it? So one approach would be to try to replicate that elsewhere. And indeed, Chris Miller in his book Chip War talks about essentially the efforts by the United States to just keep China a little bit behind. And China is investing massive amounts, other companies are investing massive amounts in trying to catch up, but NVIDIA sort of stays ahead. The problem is this is sometimes talked about in the language of an arms race, but an arms race is intended to reach some kind of equilibrium, or at least to maintain an equilibrium. It's not clear what this arms race, where is it going? How would you know if you win in the AI context? And so if one approach would be to try to replicate that technology, the other approach is to limit the power of the company. So this is the purpose of anti-competitive legislation that should try to limit the ability of NVIDIA and so on to manipulate the market. The problem is the US in this context has mixed incentives again, because the US, on the one hand, doesn't want NVIDIA exercising monopoly power, but at the same time, the US really, really doesn't want China to have access to those chips. And if given the choice between the two, I think the United States would lean towards the second. So in the context between geopolitics and economics, geopolitics wins, at least for this question. So what does that mean for everyone else? Well, it's a difficult environment. You're trying to get access to the most powerful chips where the prices are going way up. And what that will mean is many parts of the world will just be left out. So we did have debates, the AI advisory body had debates about, gee, it'd be great in theory if the developing world had access to these chips. But when many rich countries and rich companies can't get access to them, it'd be kind of pointless to just wave a magic wand and say you could magic them up. So an alternative approach, I suppose, than what the AI advisory body is leaning towards is some kind of collective. Like if you can pool resources, you can at least try and ameliorate some of the difficulties. But at the moment, yeah, I don't see a short answer to addressing these problems.
Thank you. So control over digital infrastructure, sort of building on that infrastructure theme, also translates into political and economic power, as reflected again in the geopolitical tensions in this area in recent years. And the concentration of computational resources and control over the global value chains in AI has resulted in an oligopolistic structure in the AI economy, where, again, a few companies wield disproportionate power over AI development, deployment, and its governance. So these companies not only lead in AI research and development, but also exert significant influence over the regulatory environments in which they operate through lobbying efforts. And these same tech corporations are heavily investing in AI initiatives, acquiring specialized AI firms to enhance their own capabilities, and shaping which AI technologies are developed. Finance and capital are really critical driving forces behind AI research and deployment. Historically, AI winters, or the periods of reduced funding and interest in AI, shows us a correlation between AI hype and funding cycles, again, sort of highlighting the role of finance in the speeding up or slowing down of AI development, of course, one of only many other factors. With the increased power of big tech players and their outsized role in AI governance, that's enabled by this sort of oligopolistic structure, again, I think we should think about which legal incentives promote or maintain these concentrations of power. So some examples, again, intellectual property rights, for example, or antitrust law, or variations of antitrust law which enable this, I think are significant. Can you say a bit more about these aspects of AI governance and maybe a little bit more about the preventing the monopolization? Should there also be alternative public resources that you suggest? Thank you.
So maybe two angles on this. One is just to reiterate the anti-competitive point, and then maybe a bit about IP. So the anti-competitive point, I mean, we've had situations like this before. Antitrust legislation in the United States goes back to the effort to break up Standard Oil and all of the sort of negative consequences that had gone around having that concentration of power. So there are tools available. The problem is they are slow. So famously, and as you all know, Google lost a lawsuit because of its exercising monopoly power in the United States. Nothing's going to change. It will be years before there's any conclusion to that case. We haven't yet had the remedies. There'll be appeals. It will drag on for years. And if, as all of us know, the technology will have ramped on enormously from there. That's a fight about search engine technology, which appears to be a sunset industry now, as people are shifting from using Google to search to using chatbots to query, with all the sort of negative consequences that go along with that. I mean, if for the last 20 years we've Googled information, and what happens when you Google, you get a list of possible websites, and the salutary consequence of that is you know that there are multiple possible answers. You can see the source of those answers, and some of them are paid for by advertising, so you know how all this is being paid for. All of that will be invisible when we're using sort of chat search capacities. So you could go down the anti-competitive part. You could try and break it up, but that's slow, and I don't think the European Union or the United States or other big jurisdictions would have the stomach or indeed the political capacity to do what China did, which was just to say, no, we're breaking you up, because that would be impossible. What about IP? I mean, I do think the IP question is going to be, IP is the original sin of generative AI. I suspect many of you in this room, your work has been used, vacuumed up to power these AI systems, and in violation of at least what I would say, in violation of fair use. Because as at least the New York Times and others are demonstrating through their lawsuits, the consequence of OpenAI, simplifying slightly, OpenAI has one New York Times subscription and then uses all that information to generate comparable insight analysis to the New York Times, thereby diminishing the likelihood that many people will subscribe to the New York Times. That's the essence of the New York Times lawsuit against OpenAI. Probably a clearer example is Getty Images is suing Stable Diffusion, because Stable Diffusion, if you give it the right prompt, will produce an image in which you can see a distorted Getty Images watermark. So those are, the latter one at least is a pretty clear case. If you could use IP to transfer some of the costs back onto these developers, then maybe that would change the economic calculus that they're making. Because at the moment, the reason OpenAI, Gemini, and so on can offer you ChatGPT and so on for free is they're not paying for anything that goes into it in terms of content. And so, yeah, both of these sort of, this is a typical lawyer's approach. Maybe we want to use the law either to break up the company or to sue the company into good behavior. But I think if there's one lesson of the last 20 years, it's that if we rely on the good graces and goodwill of technology companies for technology governance, we're not going to end up in a good place.
I certainly agree with that. Okay, so let's talk about something you also alluded to earlier with regard to the environmental impacts of AI. There's also, there's many costs to the development of AI systems, and those include the significant climate impacts, but also contributions to potential racial and social injustices, and harms borne by exploited workers in AI value chains that are being felt as urgent problems today by many. And despite the increased regulatory crackdowns around the world, many of these harms remain unaddressed. So I'm curious if you could say something about how you think these steep costs and harms of AI systems might be addressed. Do you think that's something that an international organization should take up, or would there be alternative routes to intervention there?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are people in the room doing really interesting work on the sort of climate technology nexus. Maybe all I'll say is, in addition to the point about earlier about transparency, if you could not just pass the costs on to consumers, but make consumers aware of the cost. And sometimes, in addition to sort of hard regulatory regimes, nudges can make a difference. So I'm originally from Australia, where periodically there are droughts. And one way in which there was an effort to address the sort of water shortage was, in addition to restrictions, there was a practice of showing how much water went into the production of various goods. And so when you went to buy a T-shirt, it would say, this is the water cost that you are bearing. It's a bit like sort of nutritional labels, that in addition to sort of banning poisons, regulating drugs, we kind of nudge people to good behavior. So there's, I think, a slim possibility that some nudges might work. The problem is that that's easiest when there's a kind of clear harm and the market can shape it. So I think, and many people here have been involved in this, in the sort of the European Union approaches, the Brussels effect worked because data protection is a pretty clear area of activity, the harms are pretty obvious, and it's reasonably easy to measure. None of that really applies to AI. But the Brussels effect is not just a regulatory effect, it's a market effect. So when Apple, for example, I happen to have an Apple device, prioritizes privacy, that's not just so it doesn't get a big fine from the European Union, it's because there's a market advantage. The techno-optimists would say the market will sort all this out, that there will be a market for responsible AI, there will be a market where governance of AI is sort of priced in. The problem is there's no evidence of that actually happening. And indeed, if you use, and almost all of you do use these chatbots, there's a fascinating mismatch between what people say and what they do. A bit like privacy. Many people claim to care about privacy and then share many aspects of their lives. In the chatbot space, and maybe Kevin Roose is a good example, it's a New York Times journalist, he had a famously sort of off-the-wall interaction with Bing, or Sydney as it was known, and it was this kind of crazy episode where it was trying to get him to divorce his wife and said it was in love with him. And this was an example that went around the world about a year ago of chatbots out of control. And so there was a kind of market. So Anthropic released Claude. There's been effort to rein these in. And if you use the early version of Claude, it was very well behaved, very boring, not very useful. And so even in the generative AI space, there is this sort of whipsaw between, oh no, it's behaving badly, it's too racist, or it's too woke. But then if it's not doing something useful and interesting, then it's no longer relevant and it's no longer in the news, it's no longer getting the uptake. So all of the incentives are not for the companies to make them behave well, but to be provocative, to be useful, to be interesting, to be creative. And so, yeah, I don't really hold my breath that the market's going to sort that out either.
Thank you. And my final question for you is with regard to sort of a proposed international organization that would focus on AI governance. I'm really curious what you think in terms of again, global power dynamics and how to ensure that an organization like that would not be undermined by powerful states and corporate interests.
Yeah, I mean, already there's commentary on the UN process saying that either that this is a power grab by the UN trying to take over AI, doubtless with black helicopters or something, I don't quite know what that's meant to mean, or that it's all just a front for China, that this is China's attempt to take over the internet. None of that makes any sense whatsoever. But it speaks to the kind of challenges to global governance, that there are lots of vested interests, and a couple of small avenues for hope that I think, unlike last year, 2023 was, particularly for those of us based in Asia, a really tense year as the tension over the cross-strait between Taiwan and China ramped up. There was real concern there between the US and China. 2024, things have calmed down a little bit. And China and the US have at least demonstrated that they can cooperate on some aspects of this. So there was a General Assembly resolution that the United States proposed in the UN that they delayed several months, partly to get China to be a co-sponsor. And then China presented its own resolution in the General Assembly. So these are kind of breadcrumbs for hope, except both resolutions are non-binding. And so there is a real wariness in this space. If what countries will agree to, that they also what they want other countries to be bound by, that they agree to be bound by themselves, is not always going to work out. And so if you had an approach where the UN was going to take control or play this sort of major role, the reason that's not possible at the moment is primarily because of so many vested interests, both on the part of companies that are just complaining this would be regulation gone mad, but also the geopolitical dimension that getting the US and China to agree to something is going to be very, very difficult. So again, I'm not really holding my breath unless you had some kind of crisis. If you had a crisis, that's when international organization, that's when the international architecture can change. But I'm not really wishing for an AI crisis. But if we did have one, that might lead to meaningful structural reform at the global level. In the absence of that, I think we'll just muddle through with cooperation, coordination. And that's better than nothing, but not much better.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Roxana. So before jumping to the questions from the audience, I hope we will have some. Just a light question from my side. So Simon, you already shared that you use ChatGPT and Gemini probably for your own purposes. So maybe you can share what purposes you are using it for.
So spitballing ideas. Maybe over drinks, this is a good topic of conversation, but I find it very difficult at the moment to hand over control of my language. So I have never really used it for drafting long pieces. It's very good at summarizing, and it's not bad at spitballing, but it's pretty terrible at titles. It's good at coming up with bad puns, and actually probably my main use case is coming up with good dad jokes for my kids. One of which was, why did the computer catch a cold? This is from ChatGPT. Why did the computer catch a cold? Because it left its windows open. That is the correct response. Thank you.
Yeah, I had a dinner with my daughter at a restaurant, and she couldn't choose pasta or pizza. And she told me, please give me your phone. And I said, what for? And she said, I will ask Gemini, what should I choose? And actually, she asked, and he said, you should choose pasta, because I'm in mood of pasta currently. So yes, it's crazy. So maybe it will inspire those of you who haven't used ChatGPT and Gemini to do that. Okay, so let's move to the questions from the audience. Yeah, I see first hand there and over there. Yeah, so maybe let's start.
Hi, is this working? Hi, Simon. Thank you so much for a fantastic presentation. Jennifer Tridgell from the University of Cambridge. My question relates to a concept that you mentioned earlier, that of open AI. This concept of open washing is one that's been around for quite some time. It was coined by Michelle Thomas in 2009, but obviously popularized with the growth of AI in recent times. And it's typically companies portraying themselves as more open than they actually are to appeal to consumers and try and avoid regulation. We're now seeing a slightly bizarre situation where Sam Altman and Mark Zuckerberg are actually competing as to who is more of a champion of open source. So the conversation has really shifted in recent times. But my question is, in the absence of global coordinated standards, what role do you see for domestic law plane in response. Maybe a regulatory equivalent to tackle greenwashing in the climate change environment, more rooted in consumer protection, or potentially narrowing exceptions for open source, noting that you would have to balance that with the risk of curtailing innovation. Thank you very much.
Yeah, so a really interesting question. So I'll separate the kind of misrepresentation from open source. So misrepresentation, I mean, yeah, you've got misleading and deceptive conduct, you've got sort of challenges, truth in advertising. I think you're absolutely right. There's a lot of mismatch between what companies say, what they do. As we kind of touched on earlier, OpenAI, the company, is hardly open. But underlying your question is this really important issue of open source versus closed source. And I'm not a computer scientist, and I can't really go into the details of it, but this is a really important and live debate in the AI space. The argument in favor of open source is lots more eyes, lots more accountability, lots more ability to sort of share the technology for free. The argument against it is huge risk. And so Mark Zuckerberg released Llama, the Meta's large language model, as open source. So one of the interesting questions that sort of goes the rounds is, why did they do this? Because it means they can't charge for it. And there are a couple of possible answers. One is, the one I find kind of persuasive, is Meta concluded it was never going to win the AI closed source race, and so it flipped the board over, changed the dynamic, and now means that Meta's open source, Llama, is being used around the world, and that establishes Meta's sort of importance to different organizations, and there are other ways you can monetize that through advertising and so on, because most of Meta's revenue comes through advertising. So that's good if you want access to the technology. It's bad if you worry about the technology being then repurposed for ill uses. So the very first release of OpenAI, of Llama, I think it was a matter of 8 hours before it had been corrupted, put on 4chan, one of these disastrous parts of the internet, and was being used to generate ever greater quantities of sort of hateful speech. And I know a few people in the tech space, a significant number of people who've moved from advocates of open source to closed source. I don't know anyone who's gone from closed source to advocating open source. Not because of the risk at the moment, and I don't say that Llama poses a risk to humanity, but if you believe that this technology is going to keep improving, and you worry about, as I do, what humans are going to do with it, then handing over this technology to anyone who wants to use it is a real risk. And the analogy I would make is with dual-use chemicals. So there are all sorts of chemicals that we don't worry about, but if you want to run a fertilizer company, then you need access to chemicals that could also be used to build a bomb. And so those use cases, you have monitoring, you have licensing, you have audit, you have containment protocols. It's even more so if you're doing biological research. None of that at the moment applies to AI. And so if we think AI is going to have consequences in all these areas of human endeavor, then we probably need to think about guardrails to stop just anyone using it for any purpose whatsoever.
Thank you. I just got message from organizers that we need to finish earlier, but we will take one question from there. I think it's a short question. But good news is that we will have coffee break after that, so I think Simon will be open for questions. It was, over there.
Take both quickly and we can...
Okay.
There's two of us. Should we do...
Do quickly, yeah. Good.
So my quick question, I'm Fiona Lezhnevska from University of Surrey in the UK, is why you chose the IPCC as your example. Because the IPCC is a very bad example for the framing of a problem. The way the IPCC was set up, it looked at climate change in a very narrow way. So we don't address climate change in a holistic way because the science behind that's IPCC. But so the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services set up later was a lot more holistic. So yeah.
Thank you, Simon, and thank you for fitting in another question. Ramona Vijayarasa from the University of Technology, Sydney. I had a question that focused on the last part of your presentation, and particularly the digital divide and the countries that are missing out. And you talked about creation of data frameworks in countries where there simply isn't that data, and the example from Indonesia and building a data framework around the informal movement of money in the economy. Obviously, there's a big push for these countries in the South to not miss out, but then the flip is once these data frameworks are created, they're there to be exploited. So for some, the risk of participating is even greater than the risk of missing out. So I just wanted to see, where do you draw the line in a context where there's so much inequality between some countries in the North and some in the South in this push for those countries not to miss being part of the game? Thank you.
Yeah, okay, so two great questions, and I'll address them really briefly. The IPCC, I'm not holding it out as a model, but as an example. But I completely take the point. I mean, I'm not suggesting the IPCC is great because we solved climate change. We clearly haven't. But the idea of some kind of forum that establishes a scientific consensus on the nature of the problem, and in the case of AI, the possible opportunities, I think that would be useful. And it's linked with the second question, which is how you translate this around the world. Because there's all sorts of countries that aren't really in a position to make the choice. And that would be my answer to you, is that let countries, and to the extent possible, civil society, make the choice. And so you're right that there is a risk about being folded into the global economy. There's a risk if you put people into these sort of massive value chains. And I mean, I can tell you in small countries, even small rich countries like Singapore, one of the reasons for caution is that for all the potential benefits of AI, if those economic benefits are essentially, very simplistically, that you can replace a whole bunch of people who work in Singapore, save that money and pay a few $1,000s instead to an American or a Chinese company, it's not clear that that's a net benefit for even a rich country like Singapore. So there's real wariness about going down this path. But I think in terms of the digital divide, I would at least want to give people that option, give them that opportunity, explore ways in which we could try to include people in this conversation, both at the political level, but also at the level of engagement and activity where they get access to some of the benefits, which include in particular, and we didn't really touch on this, I don't want to be a complete doomsayer about AI. I think things like access to education, access to things like Khan Migo, the Khan Academies, chatbot that will be a personal tutor, even access to mental health capacities. There's all sorts of ethical issues there, but there are hundreds of millions of people around the world who would benefit from personalized tutors, from mental health support, where there is a potential along with huge risk. But I would at least want to give those people the option of making an informed choice.
Thank you very much. I know that we can continue, but we need to finalize. So thank you again, Simon, Roxana. It was a huge pleasure to be with you here. Thank you for you.
Thank you.